So I've talked about my changing opinions on the 10th Doctor and how I've gone from being positive to negative to back to being positive about this particular incarnation of the Doctor, and I thought it'd be interesting to sort of map out the timeline of my opinions of the 10th Doctor and break down just why it changed so drastically across these last few years. I hope you enjoy this little experiment, and if you haven't already, please support the channel by hitting subscribe, and if you enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like, and comment your thoughts on the 10th Doctor below. We start off in 2005 with the broadcast of Parting of the Ways, not only my introduction to the 10th Doctor, but also Doctor Who as a whole, as this was my first experience to the entire show. In 2006, as I started watching random episodes of Series 2 and became a bit more familiar with the show, poor Christopher Eccleston somewhat faded into obscurity because of the marketing really wanting to push David Tennant as the face of the show, so as a result David Tennant ended up becoming my favourite of the two. By 2007 I had watched all of Series 1 and 2 and had started watching Doctor Who on initial broadcast every week. I had also started to become a bit more aware of Classic Who and watching the odd story and clip I could find online, and I can remember during a discussion about the possibility of the Sea Devils appearing in Voyage of the Damned, because at the time we didn't know the Titanic was supposed to be a spaceship, the subject of it being David Tennant's final story came up, because with the 9th Doctor it had introduced the idea that Doctors might not stick around for that long, which meant that I went through the inevitable grieving process that most fans go through when a Doctor actor has announced that they're stepping down. But I'd gone through it a year and a half early, so I was able to deal with all the stages of it before they'd even announced Tennant's departure. 2008 I'd fully settled into being a Doctor Who fan and had seen at least one episode from every Doctor up to that point. Colin Baker superseded David Tennant as my favourite Doctor overall, but I was still very positive on the 10th Doctor at this point. I was a little uncertain about Matt Smith, but across 2009, the closer we got to the departure of Tennant and the more we learnt about Series 5, the more I was excited about the prospect of a new Doctor, to the point where I was actually kind of disappointed that The End of Time was going to be a two-parter, as I was ready to see the new incarnation, which meant in 2010, much like Christopher Eccleston, Tennant somewhat faded into the background of my mind in terms of other Doctors. Because I was able to watch their episodes whenever I wanted, it meant I was less interested in checking them out. With that being said though, when they showed the 2005 TARDIS console appearing in The Doctor's Wife, it did make me interested in seeing a team up between the 10th and 11th Doctors at some point. So when it was announced that he would be returning for the 50th anniversary, I of course was very excited. Though I do remember being somewhat disappointed that certain Doctors didn't show up. I feel that 2014 was the point I started developing my critical voice, and I wasn't overly fond of Series 8 on initial airing, which made me pine for the older eras of the show. 2015, I started becoming even more frustrated with the current version of the show, and I was beginning to recognise some of the tropes and formulas that would appear across all of the Revival era seasons, and because I was so bored with them and frustrated with them in their current state, it led to a sort of sins of the father mindset where I was wondering, were they ever good in the first place? And that led me to being a bit more critical looking back on the first iteration of the show under Russell T Davies. At that point I was more interested in Doctor Who from its perspective as a show that could go anywhere and do anything. So the more down-to-earth domestic side of it wasn't really that interesting, and because of personal reasons I won't get into, I was generally miserable and a bit cynical at that point, so focusing on emotions and drama really bugged me. 2016 was about the point I started interacting with a lot more of the Doctor Who community. I found those who held a similar sentiment to me regarding the 10th Doctor and getting annoyed with some of the creative choices and how it sort of stuck around in the franchise. I also became aware of the Tennant or Nothing sentiment, the idea that the show could only be good with him as the Doctor, those who talk about how they stopped watching because he left the show. And as such, because I was so frustrated with that era, and I wanted Doctor Who to sort of move away from that version of itself, that it got really annoying for me, and I was very defensive about that fact, and it developed a really unhealthy mindset. 2017 was the point where I officially felt that David Tennant was my least favourite incarnation of the Doctor, and this is the point where I considered The End of Time to be the worst episode of the entire show, foolishly blaming it for all its issues because it touched on the subject of Doctor Who without David Tennant, and as such I took it way too seriously. And at this point I was basically using Doctor Who as sort of a metaphorical punching bag for my own personal issues. So there might have been a reasonable argument in there somewhere, but to be honest, it just came out as just incoherent rage. Things started to change for the better in 2019, where I became a bit more aware of just how annoying I was being. I still held those opinions, but I thought it best to sort of tone down my complaints about it, which inevitably led over the next 2 years to sort of reappraise Doctor Who, which not only included learning to appreciate the Capaldi era, which I sort of didn't when it first came out, but also understand why people love the 10th Doctor so much, learning why I used to like it, and being much more aware of the significance and importance that came from all the emotional character drama that Russell introduced. So in 2022, when it was announced that David Tennant and Catherine Tate would be returning for the 60th anniversary, I was initially optimistic, though the more we learnt about the 60th, the fact that David seemed to be the focus, the fact that he was apparently playing a brand new incarnation which just looked and acted like 10, my cynicism did somewhat return, but not to the same extent. I was not really looking forward to going back to that mindset and wanted to make sure that I was giving this story a fair chance. So in 2023, the more we learnt about it, the more I realised that I could still find enjoyment in this episode, even if I didn't like the direction it was going in, and also recognising the fact that it could potentially explore and deal with the issues I was having with the 10th Doctor, and actually serve as a means for the general audience to make peace to the idea that David Tennant wasn't going to be the Doctor anymore. To be clear, it's never been David Tennant that was the issue, as I've always liked him as an actor. It was more so the 10th Doctor himself, the character. How does he fare now, after all this time? Well, we'll have to wait and see following the 60th anniversary. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this interesting look into my mindset, and I'll see you next time.